Mornye's attributes have been revealed. Let's talk about it. My name is Juice, and let's get into it. Okay, so, another fusion character. I was already kind of at my limit with them when we got Galbrena, but another fusion character? Really, Kuro? Obviously, this does not detract from my excitement for this particular character. I think she is just way too interesting to write off because of a mere element. However, I do have to ask, after a certain point, when do we get enough fusion characters, Kuro? This unit would have been a perfect Glacio. We barely have any Glacio limited 5 stars, and that hurts, because I personally really like the Glacio element, and I just think that the ice element in general is a really cool one. This would have been a good candidate for that. Now, to be fair, Kuro Games is usually pretty silly with elements. They don't usually use elements that correspond with a character's color scheme. They usually do it for more lore-based reasons, like how Augusta is Electro because of solar plasma energy, which is pretty cool. So I'm sure there is a proper reason for her for being fusion, and there are actual reasons as to why she is, and I know that it's not as simple as this character is predominantly white and bluish, therefore they should be a Glacio. I know it doesn't work like that. However, as somebody who is actively waiting for the next Glacio limited 5-star release, it does still hurt a little bit. I would like to see a new Glacio character added to wuwa. However, with that being said, what can we expect from Mornye? Here's the thing. Obviously, like I said in my Lenny videos, it's kind of hard to say what these characters are going to do based on absolutely no information other than just their weapon type and their element, because we're heading into 3.0, and we can very much expect there to be some kind of new gimmick or mechanic that is going to be introduced in Lahai Roi. Now, whether that's going to be explored with the 3.0 characters, I wouldn't be able to tell you that, because both Carlotta and Roshia, who released in 2.0, were not really any pioneers of any new sort of playstyle. I suppose you could argue Carlotta somewhat was, because she ended up having 2 separate alt animations, but I more so mean the whole negative status gimmick wasn't really introduced properly until Phoebe. Yes, Rover had the mechanic in 2.0, but it basically didn't do anything before Phoebe came out. Now, in 3.0's case, we don't know what the gimmick is going to be, we have no hints as to what the gimmick is going to be, and we don't know if it's going to be explored with these new characters, but there is a chance. Now, I will say this, because Lenny was the first dripped character for 3.0, I expect Lenny to be the main DPS, and for Mornye to be a support of some variety, simply because that is how Wuthering Waves has structured it for the past long while. We haven't seen any deviation from this structure, except in single 5-star release patches where they prioritize releasing support units. I'm not too sure if she's going to end up being a 2nd or 3rd slot teammate for Lenny in particular, simply because a character releasing in the same patch as a DPS doesn't automatically mean that unit is going to end up being their support. Think about it like this. Brant Wuthering Waves released in the same patch as Phoebe. That doesn't mean that he was made as a Phoebe support, far from it. Zani and Shakona released in the same patch, however, Shakona wasn't made for Zani, she was made for the character that came directly after her, that being Cardathea, so on and so forth, and also there was Cantarella who released on her own in a singular 5-star patch, and later on ended up becoming Forlova's best installed teammate. So, just because she may end up being a support character doesn't necessarily mean that she is going to be good for Lenny in particular. Maybe she will, or she could end up being good for a future character, or she's going to end up buffing a part of the roster that we already have. I'm not too sure. They could make her an archetype buffer like what Cho Yuen is, where he's really good for echo skill damage characters, or how Yuno is really good for heavy attack damage characters, so on and so forth. That would make sense, because we've been getting more of those recently. Even Chisa as a 3rd slot teammate is specialized towards negative status teams, so there is that to consider. And I guess you could make the argument that she could end up being something to do with the fusion negative status, but I don't really think they're going to be focusing on negative statuses within 3.0. I think that if anything, they are either going to make the 2 characters in this patch decently accessible, or they are going to make them focus on whatever the new region's gimmick is. I don't really expect them to focus on a 2.0 mechanic, and I especially don't think they're going to do that with Lenny. Now, I'm not as confident with that with Mornye, simply because she is the 2nd half character, so maybe they take more liberties there, but I am not particularly sure. As for what we can tell from the weapon type, okay, in Lenny's case, because she's a pistols user, I believe that if she's an attack scaler, she's probably going to be decent on Static Mist, because it's been a general trend that limited 5-star DPSs that are pistols users tend to be pretty good on Static Mist and aren't in absolute need of their signature weapons. Now, because I'm expecting Mornye to be a support, and she's a fusion character, perhaps Wildfire Mark is going to end up being good on her. It depends if she's able to utilize the passive or not, but that could end up being nice because it is a supportive weapon, and if she ends up being good for fusion characters, well then that's going to be a nice option. If she does end up having anything to do with negative statuses, then Kumokiri is a recently released Broadblade that might end up becoming good on her, but I personally don't know if either of those are going to end up being any good on her. We're just gonna have to wait and see. Wildfire Mark, I think, has potential if she ends up being good for fusions, but I just don't think Kuro is going to make another character that is really tailored towards fusion teams. To be fair, Galbraina wasn't necessarily tailored towards fusion teams. She could absolutely utilize Lupa very well, however she had other teams and she was simply a good fusion hypercarry. The triple fusion team has already been completed for a long time, so personally, I think they're going to go in more of a Choyuan or Yuno direction, where she is going to be an archetype support, as opposed to being anything for fusions specifically, because I just personally think it will be weird to do that when we already have Lupa in the game and we already have such an abundance of fusion characters. It is a little bit disappointing that we're getting another fusion because I feel like we have so many already, but that is exactly why I feel like we're probably not going to get a character that has anything to do with fusion, simply because we already have that kind of completed at this point. That attribute has been given more than enough attention, very, very much attention, so I think it's going to be fine from here on, and they are hopefully going to make Mornye a character that does literally anything but support specifically fusion teams. So unfortunately, the weapon doesn't really tell us much. I would say that if she does end up being a support, you don't really have to sweat it too much because generally speaking, support weapons aren't really needed. Yes, recently they have been providing team-wide buffs and those do tend to be nice to have, but generally speaking, you can far more easily get away with not having signature weapon on a support than you can with a main DPS. So I wouldn't really worry about that too much as of now, especially if you're interested in both of the 3.0 characters. And as for the attribute, I think that if we use logical deduction, she is probably not going to be a strict fusion support, simply because I just don't think that would make sense. It will be really weird of Kuro to add more to a team that is already complete. I mean, maybe she could end up replacing somebody in the triple fusion team if they wanted to upscale that team. I don't really think it needs upscaling, it is already plenty strong enough, but they could do that if they wanted to. Now, what if she ends up being a main DPS? Well, I would just find that weird. First of all, because Kuro Games has never released 2 main DPSs in a singular patch before. There is a first time for everything, doesn't mean that they have to do it like that, just because that's what they've always been doing. However, I wouldn't expect them to release 2 DPSs in a patch, because we have literally never seen that happen before. Maybe this will become a first time, but I don't expect it. Another thing is that we recently got Galbraina. We already have a good fusion DPS that hasn't fallen off yet and is still very strong and competent in the current meta. So I just think it will be weird of them to make another fusion DPS when we already recently got a good fusion hypercarry and we already have a triple fusion team. So that is why I'm saying I think they are probably planning Mornye to focus more on whatever the 3.0 gimmick is, or they are going to have her buff a previously existing archetype like basic attacks or skill damage or something like that. Like I said, a Yuno or Choyuan type support, because otherwise this would be a very redundant release. We just don't need more fusions. And if they're upscaling the existing fusion characters more, all I can ask is why. There are other things we could be adding to the meta right now that would probably be more useful. I obviously can't say right now and judge if she is going to be a good pull or not, because who the freak knows? We don't have any information on her that is concrete right now. We have an attribute to go off of and a weapon type to go off of, and that can give us some information. Like in Linny's case, it made me believe that she is likely to be able to use Static Mist, but in Mornye's case, there is very little for me to say other than there is a chance that she could use Wildfire Mark nicely, and if she is a negative status character, well then there is a chance that she's going to be able to use Kumokiri nicely. But otherwise, I don't really think there is much we can deduce here, simply because I think, and I sincerely hope, that Kuro Games is going to do something unique with this character's kit, simply because another basic fusion support that helps out fusion characters would be extremely random, because we already have that archetype so well fed at this point. We need more Glacios, we need more attention to the others. Now, am I gonna be completely against it if they make a new fusion support that's really good for Lupa and Changli and Brant and all that? Yeah, kinda. I don't really want more of that. I would prefer a more unique kit that focuses on something new. And I do think that's what we're gonna get. I think it would be weird if they continued focusing on the past like that in a 3.0 big update patch. And that's not to say that old characters can't get upscales. I think that's an amazing thing that Crow's really good at, going back and making sure that all old characters do have new teammates to play with, and they make sure that everyone is kept up to a decent degree, so that you can indeed clear with whoever you want if you're willing to put in the investment and pull the right teammates. That's fine. I just think that with this specific archetype, we are fine for now. So if she ends up being a DPS, she's gotta do something unique so that she isn't just redundant in the face of Galbrina, and if she's a support, I sincerely hope that she's going to be a support that isn't just fusion chill and she is able to do something for just the wider array of a certain genre of character, or she is able to do something really good for Linny, or something along those lines. I will also add that the chance of her being good for Linny isn't literally zero, because consider this. Augusta and Yuno released in the same patch, and Yuno is Augusta's best in slot. She also happens to be fantastic for the heavy attack damage archetype on the whole. I'm kinda hoping that Mornye is gonna be something like that, really good for Linny, while also being a good character for whatever archetype she's gonna be buffing. That is my personal hope, we'll just have to see if it pans out or not. Hopefully this video is able to tell you about Mornye's new attributes. This has been Juice, signing out. And I don't even know what to say about the fact that she's a Broadblade. Like, we have so many Rectifier users in the game, this one will be a pretty understandable one, right? And then she's Broadblade, but you know what, Kuro Games? Just do your thing, I'll let you cook.